Should you become a commercial pilot in 2021? This video, we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons. In the last video, we talked about airline pilots. Airline pilots are a little bit different from commercial pilots. We're going to get into the difference in this video, and we're going to go into some reasons why you should consider becoming a commercial pilot in 2021. But first, what is a commercial pilot and what do they do? Commercial pilots pilot and navigate the flight of fixed-wing aircraft on non-scheduled air carrier routes. This is in contrast to airline pilots who work on scheduled air carrier routes. Often pilots start off as commercial pilots and work their way up to trying to become an airline pilot. Commercial pilots are involved in unscheduled flight activities such as aerial applications, charter flights, and aerial tours. Just like any kind of pilot, commercial pilots are involved in the maintenance of the aircraft, but they might actually have to load luggage themselves, unlike airline pilots. Commercial pilots can also be involved in moving around company executives. Just like airline pilots, they have a number of roles and responsibilities. They have to be experts in onboard instrumentation to pilot the aircraft when visibility is really poor. They have to perform routine checks on aircraft prior to any flight, supervise other crew members, be in correspondence with air traffic control, and more. There's generally 3 different ways people become pilots. Often people get their flight hours through military. Some people just get a lot of private lessons and try and become a pilot that way, and others go to a flight school. I kind of went over this in my airline pilot video, but it's actually pretty hard to borrow money to go to flight school for a lot of the flight schools. The federal government generally doesn't provide financial assistance or loans to people going to flight school, so often you have to go to a private bank. And then things like your credit score come into effect, and some private banks won't even allow you to borrow money to go to flight school. In fact, according to atpflightschool.com, it costs around $84,000 to become a pilot when starting with no previous experience. And the problem is, because it's really hard to get loans and borrow money to do that flight school, often family members have to step in and provide funding to help you pay for flight school. So the big barrier to entry to becoming a commercial pilot is flight school. In fact, a lot of commercial pilots do not have a college degree, and often a college degree isn't required. According to the Occupational Information Network, about 23% of surveyed commercial pilots just have a high school diploma. About 25% have a high school diploma plus some kind of certificate, and about 28% have a bachelor's degree. But keep in mind, if you had watched my airline pilot video, about 61% of airline pilots have at least a bachelor's degree. So if you're aspiring to eventually become an airline pilot, like a lot of commercial pilots do, because airline pilots make a lot of money, keep in mind that you might need to get a bachelor's degree to become competitive. In my last video, I talked about how there's hundreds, there's not thousands, there's hundreds of job openings for airline pilots all over the United States. It's not very many at all. We're going to get into the job market for commercial pilots a little bit later in the video. So let's get into some of the pros and cons of becoming a commercial pilot. First thing I want to go over is an interesting study done in 2016 and 2018. According to Tinder, they looked at the most right-swiped jobs in their database, and they looked at them in 2016 and 2018. They found that pilots were actually the most right-swiped by women, according to Tinder in 2016, and they were number 2 in 2018. So pilots remain pretty desirable to women, even after the golden age of being a pilot, like kind of in the 70s and the 80s. So pilots are still seen as pretty desirable to opposite sex, specifically women to men. So that's definitely one pro of becoming a pilot. Next up, we're going to go into the compensation of pilots. And this is another huge reason why you might want to consider becoming a pilot. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2020, the average base salary for a commercial pilot was $110,830. This is a lot of money compared to similar occupations, especially when you consider the fact that not a lot of commercial pilots have a bachelor's degree. In fact, quite a few just have a high school diploma plus some kind of certificate. But again, flight school can be really expensive. So this is less than airline pilots. The average base salary for an airline pilot was around $187,000 per year. And this is regional airline pilots combined with national and probably international thrown in as well. And also commercial pilots make a little bit less than air traffic controllers. They tend to earn around $127,000 per year. But compared to, bus drivers, flight attendants, locomotive engineers, people that work on railroads, commercial pilots do pretty well, and they have the ability to become airline pilots in the future. And regarding the average base salary, it has been increasing really rapidly for commercial pilots. In the year 2000, the average base salary for a commercial pilot was $51,370. Again, this includes no benefits. By 2020, the average base salary rose to $110,830. So basically, their base salaries over doubled in about 2 decades. So when you look at the 2000 to 2020 wage growth, commercial pilots are seeing about $4,200 more every single year. When you're just looking at 2015 to 2020, this increases to $4,400 per year. So this is really good wage growth. Even when you compare it to engineering, software development, a lot of other hot fields, commercial pilot wages are increasing pretty rapidly, especially in the past 5 years. If you were to take this average base salary plotted into the future, by 2024, the average base salary for a commercial pilot would be around $128,000 per year. By 2030, about $153,000 per year. So commercial pilot wages are predicted to increase pretty rapidly going into the future. So commercial pilots can definitely do pretty well financially. Another advantage to becoming a commercial pilot is the entrepreneurial rate. About 5% of commercial pilots are self-employed. So this could be a good occupation for someone that's a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more entrepreneurial. If you want to own like a little tour company, or maybe you want to spray pesticides and help farmers out. There's lots of different little niche entrepreneurial business opportunities commercial pilots have. So there's way more entrepreneurial opportunity for commercial pilots over airline pilots, air traffic controllers, ambulance drivers, and more. So being able to own your own business as a commercial pilot is definitely an advantage, and commercial pilots definitely have the ability to become airline pilots in the future, although it's getting really competitive as of right now. So speaking of competition, we're going to talk about the jobs market. How competitive is it to try and become a commercial pilot in 2021? There's actually not that many commercial pilots in the workforce. According to the government, in 2020, there was 37,120 commercial pilots employed in the United States. This is much less than the number of airline pilots employed, and it's far less than the number of light truck drivers and heavy truck drivers. So you might have to cross state lines in order to get a particular job opportunity because the workforce really isn't that big. But it actually has grown pretty substantially over time. In the year 2000, according to the government, there were 18,040 employed commercial pilots. By 2020, there was about 37,120. So the number of employed, the workforce, has doubled in about 2 decades. Although since 2015, the number of employed has fallen a little bit. But the government does have a pretty bullish stance on commercial pilots going into the future. They're predicting a 13% increase in the number of commercial pilots over the next 10 years. This is partially because of a lot of pilots are older and a lot of the workforce for pilots is older. So a lot of those guys are going to be retiring over the next 10 years, leading to more job opportunities for commercial and airline pilots. And also, like I spoke about before, there's actually less people becoming pilots. It used to be people would go into the military, specifically the Air Force, and try and become a pilot that way. Get the military to pay for your flight school and your flight hours. Come out of the military 5 to 10 years later, you suddenly have lots of flight hours and you can immediately go into the private sector. This isn't occurring as much because of the use of drones. So if the military is paying for less people to go and try and become a pilot, this means that there could be less people entering the occupation because, like I said earlier, the federal government won't provide you loans for a flight school. It's like you have to go get loans from your family or a private bank where the interest rate might be high. There's certain other financial barriers to entry preventing people from becoming pilots. So because of these trends, the government's predicting a 13% increase in commercial pilots and a 14% increase in airline pilots. And this is not the type of occupation that's going to be automated away. Airlines are not interested in removing pilots. That would probably freak a lot of passengers out. Would you fly in an airplane without a pilot? I definitely would not. So the government is pretty bullish on the future job prospects of commercial pilots. But as of right now, pilots are hurting a little bit. In my last video on airline pilots, I showed that there's hundreds of job postings when there should be thousands. You would think there'd be thousands. And this is partially because of the pandemic and a couple other things. So I went on Indeed, and this time I just searched for pilot. I didn't type in commercial pilot. I was just curious at the number of job postings for pilot specifically in the United States. I usually use Indeed, Glassdoor, and LinkedIn to look at the number of job postings for different occupations to gauge how competitive they are, how hard they are to get into. So on Glassdoor, I found 1,488 job postings for pilot in the United States. On Indeed, 4,532. And on LinkedIn, there was, I think this is because there was a lot of job postings unrelated to becoming a pilot, but there was 37,253. And I just think it's because I saw software developers in there. So it's kind of weird. LinkedIn is weird because it's like you perform a search, but you see a lot of job postings unrelated to what you're searching for. So when you consider the number of job postings for Glassdoor.com and Indeed.com, it does look pretty competitive when you factor in that there's about 37,000 employed commercial pilots and about 83,000 employed airline pilots. So it does look pretty challenging to get a job at this moment in time, but it should be easier going into the future. Finally, one thing people like to do when they're trying to search for different occupations that they're interested in, they ask themselves, would this particular occupation be compatible with my personality? Maybe I'm extroverted, introverted, organized, unorganized, things like that. Would my personality be compatible with this particular occupation? According to the Myers-Briggs company, there are certain personality types that are really attracted to becoming an airline pilot. So the 4 most likely types to become an aircraft pilot is the ESTJ, the director. Number 2 is the ENTJ, the commander. No surprise there. Number 3, ESTP, the persuader. And number 4, the ISTJ, the inspector. Notice that all 4 of these types have a preference for thinking over feeling, and 3 of the 4 types have a preference for extroversion over introversion. So those are some pros and cons of becoming a commercial pilot in 2021. If you enjoyed this video, definitely also check out my airline pilot video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.